And now we can begin. So, Bruchim Habayim, Erev Tov, everyone. Nice to have you all with me here and to be together for a little bit of study of this week's Parashah. I'm actually going to start with, I'm going to share a screen with you. So just give me a thumbs up if it shows up. You never know if it works okay. It's there on the screen. Fantastic. All right. So I don't know if any of you can read this or know what this is, but I've made mention in the past that one of the things that enchanted me most when I visited Israel, and certainly when I moved there afterwards, was finding phrases from the Tanakh, from the Bible, especially from the Torah, in everyday use. And anyone who's written public transportation in Israel, and the signs change, I could have brought you a variety of different signs. This sign still shows up in the buses. I don't know if it's in the trains, but I know it's in the buses, and it says Mipnei Seva Takum. We read that verse a couple weeks ago in Parshat Kedoshim, one of many dealing with how we should treat our fellow human beings, of whatever nature, whatever state they're in their lives, particularly those who are frail and vulnerable, and certainly the elderly fall into that category as well. I'll just ask that everybody mute themselves. I didn't mute you automatically. Just like, I hear some background noise there. So seeing this in a bus in Israel was fascinating for me. Seeing the words of the Tanakh, these wonderful injunctions of social action and social responsibility and caring for others, literally in front of my eyes. And so that's something that's very powerful for me. And perhaps no less, I remember going to Philadelphia years ago. I think the first time was before I moved to Israel, back in my teens, and making a pilgrimage, as most people have, to the Liberty Bell. How many of you have been to Philadelphia, seen that cracked Liberty Bell, whether the original or whatever? Okay. And again, it's a pretty powerful thing because on that Liberty Bell, of course, is written, proclaim liberty throughout the land. And that's a verse we read in this week's Parashah. Ukratem dror ba'aretz l'chol yoshveha. So proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. And I'll come back to that phrase a little bit later. But again, growing up, I would have to admit, in a rather parochial environment, as involved as my parents were in things outside the Jewish community, I went to Associated in Chat. And our grounding in Jewish texts, certainly Torah and the rest of Tanakh among them, was that this is a Jewish text. A Jewish text, meaning those are the words that we're familiar with and we try to live by. But when you see it, and again, I admit to my ignorance, when you see it as something that other faith communities have adopted as a very powerful direction and instruction about how to live your lives, however much they actually realize that, there's something very powerful about it. So I remember going by this bell in Philadelphia and thinking, wow, that's something that's written in our Torah. I don't remember what week it was, but it was sometime, I recall around May. I don't remember if it happened to be Parshat Bahar at the time, but probably pretty close. And this is something that I think we often forget to appreciate. And sometimes we allow others who try to criticize Judaism and Jews and Israel, we often allow them to take away the pride we have in those verses and the fact that other communities share those as well. The three faiths that we often speak about most, and those are certainly not the only ones, but Christianity, Islam, and Judaism certainly use a lot of these phrases and narratives as part of their tradition. It's not they disregard them and say they're passé. No, many of those phrases continue to be used in those religious communities as well. But also some of these phrases have taken on political and social meanings, such as proclaim liberty throughout the land. So when I was looking at this week's Parashah, a number of things struck me as very powerful, and I'm not going to go into Bechukotai. There's so much in Bahar, as short as it is, that gives us some wonderful insights into, I would say, the nature of Judaism, something that we don't always consider. So if we look at the beginning of Parashat Behar, what do we read about? We read about a sabbatical year. We read about a jubilee year. Let's start with the sabbatical. How many of you have ever taken a sabbatical? Who's taken what they would rightly and appropriately define, and there's a broad definition of that, as a sabbatical year? Again, sabbatical year needn't be a 365-day year, but a sabbatical. Who's actually taken one? Anyone? Really? Well, then you're overdue for one. It sounds like some of you are due for a jubilee year, let alone a sabbatical year. Wow. So a sabbatical year, the idea, of course, being based on Shabbat. And what is Shabbat about? Why do we take this idea of a seventh something? Because that seventh day of the week gives us a chance, as I don't need to tell you, and everybody does something different in their Shabbat, and there's many different ways to express our appreciation for that Shabbat, is to reset. You've been working the whole week in a certain mode, and it gives you a chance to reset. But it's a bit of a cliche to reset. What do you mean to reset? What have I been doing for which I need to reset? And so Rabbi Yitz Greenberg talks about the idea that Sabbath, during the Shabbat, you're engaged in business, in all sorts of different work, in labor, and many times those experiences are not necessarily based on application of all the social action and social responsibility laws that we read about, not just in Kedoshim and Behar, but throughout the Bible. What do I mean by that? When we talk about property, when we talk about being fair to employees, when we talk about thinking of the environment, we're often doing things that's not premier in our mind. We don't make those a priority. Nowadays, that's more the case, and there are many more businesses and workplaces that are more aware and acknowledge the importance of being aware of environment and social responsibility, but not all of them. And so Rabbi Greenberg suggests that the Shabbat, the weekly Shabbat, is an opportunity for us to reset and think about the way we act during the week. Is that appropriate? It's not that we need a physical rest. We need a rest from practices that might not be ideal. We may be thinking that we're living our lives the best way we possibly can, both with regards to our own welfare as well as that of others, but maybe not. And we need that chance to reset and think about what? To think about creation, where everything starts at what you might call ground zero. We all start at the same place at creation. Everything and everybody is equal. I should say everyone is equal, because of course we know that from creation, God assigned us the opportunity to rule over the earth and all the creatures that live in it, however we define that, but very carefully put to rule and preserve, to keep and rule, meaning we have a responsibility as well, especially because we have perhaps greater powers, mostly intellectual, mostly capacity to empathize and to understand things that other creatures don't have the opportunity to do. So, in summary, the idea of Shabbat is for us to take a chance to reset and think about what we as individuals, how we fulfill the idea of creation and the equality, at least among human beings, that creation implies and entails. So that's on an individual basis. Then we have this idea of a sabbatical. And there, the idea of a reset is taken on a much larger scale. There, you have the opportunity for not just you as an individual, but for your community, for the land, if you allow it, to take that reset as well. The land grows fatigued over time and is overused as well. And we perhaps abuse and don't consider the impact that we have on the environment. And so that once in every 7 years is an opportunity for us to appreciate to a greater extent, again, going back to the idea of creation and how everything is perhaps created and placed on this earth to live in some kind of symbiotic, collaborative relationship. And this once during these 7 years is an opportunity for us to rethink that type of relationship that we have with the earth, with the environment, but also with our fellow human beings on a larger scale. So if people have not had the opportunity and have fallen into tough times, they have an opportunity to redeem during that 7th year as well. And of course, that's taken on the largest scale in the Jubilee year, where everything goes back to reset. Everything we've done in terms of business, in terms of ownership, is returned to the original owner. That can't be a more dramatic, revolutionary statement about reset. There's nothing more revolutionary and utopian than the idea of a Jubilee year. No matter what you have, what you own, you cannot work the land. You have to share that land with everybody, as in the sabbatical year. But not only that, whatever land you may have acquired under circumstances where somebody may have been at a disadvantage, that land goes back to the original owner. Could that work today? No. If I were to ask you, when does the next Jubilee year occur? Does anyone know? When's our next Jubilee year? The 7th, the sabbatical year, everybody knows. We abide by that to a certain extent in Israel, and it only pertains to Israel, not outside of Israel. However we define what the land of Israel is, that's another question. But when's the next Jubilee year? When do we do that total, universal, utopian reset for humanity and the earth? We don't. It hasn't been done since, according to some rabbis, since the exile of the 10 tribes by Assyria. And why is that? Because there are all sorts of interpretations that in order for the Jubilee year to occur, Israel, meaning the children of Israel, have to live in the land of Israel, or at least remnants of all the tribes have to be there. That hasn't been true since the year 721 before the Common Era. And therefore, as some would say, there has been no obligation to perform that Jubilee year for the last 2,800 years. Amazing. It hasn't happened. Nobody knows. There's no calculation for the Jubilee year because it's not implemented. It's not something that is realistic. And maybe all the excuses about not everybody being there, not being in, having sovereignty over the land, that might be all a rationalization of the denial of something that is utopian and revolutionary in nature. Because as Rabbi Greenberg also suggests, Judaism is often something that can be seen as maintaining status quo, maintaining social order, maintaining stability. Think of all the laws we have for making sure that damages are correctly paid if the damages are caused by somebody to your house, to your home, to your person. All the laws of responsibility for ownership of land as well. Judaism has this incredibly vast array of laws that make sure that people appreciate the fact that things are owned by others. And yet, at the same time, we have this, what seems to be an incredibly contradictory statement about everything going back on a reset in the 50th year. But it hasn't occurred, at least in 2,800 years. And I don't know if it ever occurred to the full extent that's described in Parashat Behar and elaborated later on in different passages in the Talmud. If it ever occurred 2,800 years ago, who knows what it looked like? And it would only have been around for a couple of hundred years since the children of Israel entered the promised land. So we don't really know if it ever occurred in the way it did. We probably know for certain that it would be impossible to implement today. I can't see any nation, any community, except for perhaps a very small, I won't use the word cult-like, but a very small, tightly knit, closed community to be able to do that. But again, only on a very small basis. To do that on some universal basis is not something that people would accept nowadays. Our values are very different. We may have a sense of social responsibility, but capitalism still reigns in most of the world. And it would have to be perhaps a very revolutionary socialist approach, which was tried to an extent, of course, in the Soviet Union, but we see it never succeeded because it was certainly never implemented to the same extent and in the same way that the Torah describes. But we'll leave that for another day. So this idea of a contradiction between some universal, beautiful utopian idea and the reality of the laws that we have for people to maintain and acknowledge that ownership occurs. And so I was thinking, is this what the Torah wants us to strive towards? Do they want us to work? Is that really the goal of Judaism? Working towards that utopian situation where everyone at some point, if not on a permanent basis, has the same, is treated the same with respect and dignity. Nobody falls to the wayside. Everyone is taken care of in some way. And that this ideal world that we want to create. And I think about what happened at the outset of the Torah. We talk about a Garden of Eden. How far did that go? Not even a generation did that Garden of Eden last. And I would, as I think I've said before, I think if God really intended for the world to be this Garden of Eden, where everyone respected one another, everybody had equal ability, equal share, that would not be a world that would mean a whole lot in a Jewish context. Because what's one of the most basic ideals of Judaism? Something we call tikkun olam, repairing, fixing, learning the world. How can you do that if the world is a Garden of Eden? It might be a great place for angels to live, but not for human beings. And if you look at it, what might God or angels do if there were not the imperfect, faulty humans that live on this world? And you don't have to stick to Jewish tradition. Look at Greek mythology. What is Greek mythology without the intervention of gods in the lives of humans? Humanity presents a challenge to the divine, not just in Greek mythology, but in Jewish tradition as well. Look at the stories, the narratives in the Torah and in the Tanakh in general. We read about God's dissatisfaction or perhaps feigned dissatisfaction with what's going on. God is probably having the entertainment time of God's life up there, watching and enjoying what's going on, sometimes perhaps not enjoying, but watching how humans deal with their reality, how they deal with one another, how they relate to the divine, if they actually believe something like that exists. If there isn't this idea that you have to strive towards something better, then what purpose do we have on earth? If everything is fine, if everyone is treated equal, then there isn't much interest in life. And you might say, well, we don't need those wars. We don't need genocide. We don't need murder. We don't need slave trade. Those are all a consequence of us not following a certain striving for a better world. That's when we allow those things to happen. But I think that the purpose of us being on earth is to work towards something better, but with the understanding that we're never going to achieve that. And why would I think that? Because if you look in this week's Parashah, as well as other places, particularly in Parashat Re'eh, in the book of Dvarim, Deuteronomy, I think it's chapter 15, verse 11, what does it say? It says, there's a fascinating verse there, Ki lo yechdal evyon mikerev haaretz. There will always be the unfortunate, the poor on this earth. So what are we saying here? We're never going to have a situation where there are no poor. We're never going to have a situation where there are no orphans. We're never going to have a reality where people who are less fortunate and more fragile and taken advantage of doesn't exist. That is our motivation to make a better world. If everyone were created exactly equal with the same ability, the same capabilities, the same emotional stability, nothing would have happened on this earth. We would have been living in a Garden of Eden, eating fruits off trees without any motivation to do anything else because everything is so perfect. There's no drive. There's nothing to motivate us to create. You might say we've created some horrible things. Yes, we have, but we've created some wonderful things as well. And I don't think the purpose of the Torah in suggesting this utopian Jubilee year and all it implies is that that's really something that's going to happen. It's saying to us, things could be a lot better. You could work towards this idea of everyone having an opportunity once in a while to get a reset. We're not going to do that because people are not going to give up their fortunes. They're not going to give up their homes voluntarily. They're not going to give up things they have that have become important and that are valued in the Jewish tradition as well as in other faith communities, because that's the way humans are. And I can't see human nature changing to such a great extent that we would want or strive to actually live in something, whatever that Garden of Eden may have been. And there are a number of indications in our Parashah that suggest if that's the case, if that's the way we're going to continue to be, then what can we do? What should motivate us to make opportunity more available to those who perhaps don't have it? So I spoke this morning briefly at the Minyan about a fascinating phrase that occurs 3 times in this week's Parsha. We talk about this utopian plan, but they're very, very specific things that we need to be doing, not just imagining some grandiose scheme where everything will work out for all. What's our personal responsibility? And I shared my understanding of this phrase, v'chi yamuch achicha. And I mentioned that in the Eitz Chaim, it's translated as if your kinsman, achicha, your brother literally, is in straits. So mach in Hebrew means a poor person, somebody without money, somebody without a fortune. But it's very similar, as I suggested this morning, and as commentators have offered, from the word namuch, somebody who has stumbled, who has fallen, who is lower in however you might define it than the rest of the people. What does that mean, lower or stumbled? It means somebody who's come across hard times, somebody who's gotten into debt, someone who, because of that debt and because of that dire situation, has done things perhaps that they're remorseful for, and perhaps even worse, has, at least in biblical terms, sold oneself into servitude or slavery. And what I found fascinating is that it mentions 3 situations, starting with something rather minor, but getting worse all the time. So the first one talks about, and this is if you want to follow, but you can just listen, in chapter 25, verse 25, it says, if your kinsman is in straits and has to sell part of his holding, his nearest redeemer shall come and redeem what his kinsman has sold. So what happened? What does that mean? If for whatever reason you have a piece of land, and remember, the essence of being an Israelite in the desert was to be making your way to the Holy Land, to inherit the land as assigned to each tribe, meaning everybody was going to get a piece of land. That was going to be your identity with the land of Israel. That was as central, perhaps, as sacrificing to God. This idea that I have been promised this land beginning with Abraham, and now I'm going to finally inherit this land after having been liberated from Egypt, traveling through the desert, surviving for 40 years on whatever, and now this is my turn to inherit my piece of land. So the sense of land ownership is incredibly powerful in the Bible. We don't always appreciate that. And those of us who live in a condo or in a house on a small plot of land perhaps don't appreciate this idea of inheriting land. And because we're so mobile today, the idea of passing on that same piece of land from generation to generation is practically non-existent anymore. There are people who have farms and have passed land on, but if you think about it, we've only been in Canada for a few generations, so we haven't developed the sense of inheriting and passing on land. That was central to this idea. We remember Benot Tzlofchad, the daughters of Tzlofchad, fighting for their rights to be able to inherit land because there were no men in the family to inherit it. And they came to some agreement, not ideal, but the idea that that land has to remain within the tribe. It has to be connected from generation to generation within that same family or community or tribal unit. We don't have that sense today. We don't understand what that means. But that's the first sense of loss that this person feels. If because of his or her situation, they have to sell their land. They can't maintain themselves on the land. So they sell their land. They're not selling themselves. They're selling their land in order to be able to continue to survive. But when they do that, they sell their livelihood. They're no longer able to maintain a livelihood because agriculture was what most people based their livelihood on in ancient times. So that's this first stage. And what's our responsibility? If he has no one to help him redeem that land, buy it back, then we have to find a way to help him do that. If he lacks sufficient means to recover it, what he sold shall remain with the purchaser, until the Jubilee. In the Jubilee year, it will be released, and he shall return to his holding. So that appreciation, even if utopian, that a piece of land has to remain within the same family, within the same clan, within the same tribe, within the nation. It can't be something that's transferred. So when we think today, and I include myself in this, when we try to understand the often psychotic association that those extremist settlers in the West Bank feel when they go lodge themselves on a hilltop on what was until recently Palestinian land, they're basing their understanding on this connection that Israel has had with the land of Israel as promised by God, that it needs to remain within the ownership and sovereignty of Israelites, of Jews today, of the state of Israel. And that's where their commitment, if I can use that word, I certainly don't hesitate to use the extremist and violent approach to that. That's where it comes from. You may say, well, that's a misunderstanding, but no, that's what it says in the Torah. We have to have that connection with the land. It doesn't matter that it hasn't been in Jewish hands for 2,000 years. So there's a gap here. We have to close that gap and get that land back. So that's where that fanaticism comes from. It stems from this biblical importance placed on maintaining land within the Jewish people, back then within the Israelite nation. So it's not that something that comes out of nowhere. There's a biblical basis for it, and that's what they often base it on. But I don't hesitate to use or to say that that basis in a contemporary world is at best misguided. And there are other considerations we need to take because we have different appreciations of what the connection to land should be. I'll come back to that in a moment. So that's the first thing, the first stage. Someone's lost their land. We need to have an arrangement where they can redeem that and get it back into the clan, into the tribe. The second one, if your kinsman being in straits, again, yamuch achicha, comes under your authority. What does that mean, your authority? It means if, even by selling his land, he doesn't have enough to make a livelihood, then he's going to borrow money from somebody. So if he borrows money from you, he, in a sense, has come under your authority because he's owing you money. And if he doesn't have a chance to pay it back, you can't take any interest. You have to give that loan interest free. You're not allowed to take interest from him. You can't take advantage of him or her when they're in that situation. And lastly, if the situation becomes so dire, v'nimkar lecha lo tavod bo avodat aved. If that person gets to the point where they sell themselves to you because they can't borrow money, they have no land, they need a way to be able to eat, so they've sold themselves and work as a slave or as a servant in order to provide for their family. So these three stages of deterioration in the independence, the economic viability of an individual is described here, and all the time it's saying, you shouldn't be letting this happen. You shouldn't let it get from one stage to the next. And I shared the example this morning when I said that when we go on the street, downtown Toronto, and we come across a homeless person lying on the ground, that's as low physically, tangibly, as you can get. When we come across a person like that, that person is past these three stages. We have not done our job as a society in trying to prevent that person from getting to that stage. And what we need to do is to make sure that our approach to the dignity and the economic viability of an individual is done through prevention. Meaning the moment we see him, and that's why they do it in three stages, the moment we see that person having trouble, we need to make sure why they're having trouble. Maybe they don't have enough education. Maybe they don't know how to manage their money. They don't know how to do their job properly. They can't find a good paying job. Our responsibility as a society is to make sure they have the means, the education, in order to provide for themselves on a sustainable basis, not just on a temporary and not just for a momentary basis. It's got to be something with which they can maintain themselves. So the bottom line is that we can't allow our fellow human beings, and I expand that beyond our kinsmen, of course, we can't allow our fellow human beings to get to the point where they are destitute and lose all independence and dignity. That's what we have to strive towards. And that, I would say, is in harsh contrast at the same time that it's reflecting the values of that utopian world described by Ukratem Dror, calling for liberty throughout the land. Everyone should be free of economic intolerance. Everyone should be free of being subjected to slavery, to servitude, out of which they can find no exit. And the Torah gives us these very practical ways in which to do it. Just want to share a couple of other phrases that I find quite fascinating and engaging as well. It says in that phrase, Ukratem dror ba'aretz l'chol yoshveha, you shall proclaim liberty. The word dror is only used in a few times in the entire Torah. And Rabbi Yehuda from the Talmudic times says that dror is similar to the word dir, dayar, meaning a dwelling. So what is proclaiming liberty throughout the land? Proclaiming liberty is proclaiming the ability of everyone to have a dwelling place. That's liberty. And a lot of you might say, and sometimes I feel that as well, owning a place is far from liberty. You're tied, you're enslaved to a mortgage, to payments, to maintaining that place. And if you own other property where you have to maintain it in a respectable and dignified way for tenants or other residents. So in a sense, you might say that owning a dwelling is something, if anything, that enslaves you rather than frees you. But no, Rabbi Yehuda is saying, in order to be genuinely free, you have to be free to be able to choose where you're going to live. And I remember I have a nephew who feels that being free is being free, meaning to wander the earth, wander around on your own, no ties to any specific place. That's freedom in his opinion. But that's not real freedom, because you're enslaved by the uncertainty of your status, unless you're a very wealthy person who can afford to, whenever they go, to stay in a hotel, a five-star hotel. But for those who don't own their own homes, those are the people who are not free. And you don't need to go too far to understand the lack of freedom that most homeless people feel. The greatest sense of independence that they could have is if they were able to have a dwelling of their own. But that's a solution that requires a lot of effort on our part, not just to throw them into a house, but to provide them with the resources and the means and the knowledge of how to maintain themselves in that situation. But this idea that true liberty is being able to choose where you live. And it's interesting, and I'll share something for you written by somebody by the name of Tehila Goldberg. She talks about the fact that dror as well. Anybody know what dror is in modern Hebrew? Dror is a sparrow. And so a sparrow is a bird. And it's interesting that the idea of a bird is used for freedom, because we often talk about a bird as being the freest of all creatures, be able to flap your wings and go wherever you want. But a bird also comes back to a nest. A bird doesn't fly wandering the earth. They may migrate to different places, but they come back to a nest, and they may have two nests, one in the north, one in the south, and whatever their migration path takes. So this idea of calling a place a home and feeling rooted somewhere is the true freedom that we're talking about. So I think it's no coincidence that the idea of a sparrow, a type of bird, reflects what true liberty can be. One other phrase that I found quite interesting is also this. It says, Ukratem dror ba'aretz l'chol yoshveha, to all the inhabitants. Well, why do you need to proclaim liberty to all the inhabitants if only some of them are those who are enslaved, if only some are those who may be homeless, what about the majority of middle class and wealthy people who own their own homes, who own slaves, if we're talking about a time thousands of years ago? Why does liberty have to be proclaimed to them? They know what liberty is. They have financial and economic liberty. Why is liberty to them? Liberty should be proclaimed to the people who are less fortunate, who have come into those dire straits as described by the Torah. But no, liberty needs to be proclaimed because it's often the people who are not aware through their deeds, through their inaction, that they have a responsibility for those who are less fortunate. And what does that mean? It means that if I'm not sensitive enough or aware of what I'm doing or what I'm not doing, then I'm not aware of liberty that should be applied and offered to others. And even more so, if I am a slave owner, and again, I'm talking about ancient times, although unfortunately today there are plenty who are involved in various expressions of slavery, whether it be the sex trade or other elements where child labor, where people are taken and literally held against their will as slaves or as servants. That is going to have an effect on me as well as somebody who perpetrates that oppression of others. And so when we proclaim liberty throughout the land to all the inhabitants, it's to both those who suffer from the slavery and from the homelessness, as well as those who are the cause of those. Whether those people are willing to acknowledge it or not, they need to be aware of this proclamation of liberty. They need to do things. And if they're not those who bring about those conditions, those situations, then they need to be the people who bring about a change for the better. And if they're not aware of that and are indifferent and sit by the wayside and not get involved, that's why a proclamation of liberty has to be made to all the inhabitants, to everyone. They all have to be aware of what needs to be done. I'm going to stop for a moment. If anyone has any questions, I just have a couple of brief things that I wanted to share towards the end, but if anyone has any comments they'd like to share at this point, feel free to unmute yourself.
You prompted a question when you were talking about the Jubilee year and it's never been done. And I was curious because when Ben-Gurion set up the state of Israel, he separated the state and the politics from the religion. And he, if my understanding is, gave the rabbis the rule of the law, so to speak, to follow. Why didn't the rabbis then begin to initiate that, since they were following all of the other rules?
Well, I think, you mean in terms of this idea of a Jubilee year?
Yes.
I think for the same reasons that it hasn't been maintained since then. We don't have a majority of Jews, and certainly not at the time of the founding of the state, who live in Israel. There's just a smattering. And again, this idea that there have to be representatives of all the tribes in their allotted areas, and that certainly wasn't the case when the state was founded. There's no definition of tribes. We don't know even of those 10 tribes. So it's impossible to say that the tribe of Gad or Ephraim or Zvulun, oh, we have some representatives who are living in, who are coming from Poland or from Yemen, they'll come and settle their land. They didn't have those, and so that's part of the explanation of why. But I think it was decided by rabbis centuries ago that Jubilee year is not something that is relevant any longer because of the dissolution of those tribal entities 2,700 years ago, or at least since the destruction of the first temple 2,600 years ago. So that's not something they thought of. They did think of Shemitah, and that's something that's been instituted. And there's an approach by the conservative movement about Shemitah, trying to encourage kibbutzim, for example, to set aside a piece of land that would be considered. They don't have to have the entire kibbutzim holdings, agricultural holdings, at least this is years ago when they thought about this, lie fallow. But they said, leave one section of your fields fallow. So there is this idea that people who are less fortunate can come and take advantage of that and take whatever crops grow there. They'll have access to it just as you would have access to it. And part of the power of the sabbatical year is that you should feel what those people who don't have the opportunity to have their own land feel. And I showed you a picture, I forget where it was, I think it was at the Minion last week. I showed you that picture of the gleaners.
Of the
those
gleaners
people who were
by
gathering
Malay.
gleanings, bent over, picking up whatever was left. And the fact that landowners during the sabbatical year are not allowed to harvest crops like they do normally. They can go out to the field and pick like everyone else in order for them to better empathize with those who have to do that as a career. That's where they get things all the time. You have to experience it for that year so you can understand what it means not to be in control of your land, not to be able to invest or produce or grow crops that you would like, but to be at the mercy of whatever happens to grow in that field in that year and to share it with others who never have anything available. That is the goal of the Torah, to allow us to empathize with those who experience that on a regular basis. And it's incredibly powerful. At the end of the Parsha, we always talk about the fact that we were strangers in the land of Egypt. And we were slaves in the land of Egypt. But what does it say at the end of the Parsha? It says something quite amazing. It says, Higerim, when it talks about the land, and the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year and returning land because the land belongs to God, it says, Kigerim v'toshavim atem imadi. Why are all these rules in place? Because you are strangers and residents with me. You're not the owners. You're not the people who have lived here forever. You are strangers and you are only residents in this land. It's not something in the past. It's not something that you once experienced and therefore you have a better understanding of how to treat others. It's because you're still of that status with me. You may think with other humans that you own the land, and that's fine. That's the way you want to relate and have a dynamic with other human beings. But with me, you don't own that land. I own the land. You are strangers in this land, even though you're inheriting it according to the promise I made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. And you are residents here. Maybe permanent residents, but residents nonetheless. You're not the owners of that land. And at the end of the Parsha, most powerful statement, the very last statement, it says, Ki li b'nei Yisrael avadim, avadaihem, asher hotzeti otam me'eretz Mitzrayim ani Adonai Elohechem. For it is to me that the Israelites are servants. They are my servants, whom I freed from the land of Egypt. Fantastic contradiction in terms. And it doesn't say servants. It says the word is slaves, avadim, the same word we used to describe them in Egypt. It says, you are slaves to me, slaves whom I freed. So how can God have freed them and they still remain slaves? So this idea that they were freed from human slavery, but they remain slaves in the eyes of God because they need to be able to understand forever what it means to be slaves, what it means to be strangers. You're still of that status with me, with God, even if you consider yourselves other than that with the rest of humanity. And that is the true way for people to have the kind of compassion and empathy and sensitivity to deal with those who are not just slaves or strangers with God, but who are slaves and strangers with the rest of human beings in whatever place they live. The last thing I would say is this. We talk about this idea of importance and connection with the land. And we talk about the impact that somebody being dispossessed of their land, we talked about that individual, the chiyamuch achicha, what that means once you are dispossessed of your land. And it needs to be our goal to help people regain that connection with the land. And what I don't hesitate to say, as controversial as it may seem, it's one thing to say if your kinsman becomes dispossessed of the land, but what if you are responsible for other people being dispossessed of their land? I saw an incredibly powerful, there's a documentary, the TIFF Docs Festival's on now, and I saw an incredibly powerful movie, I thought, called My Tree. In a nutshell, because I don't give a spoiler, I think it's worth seeing. It talks about somebody who received a tree, a J&F tree planted in their honor on their bar mitzvah in 1975. And this person decides to go to Israel to try to find that tree. And it starts off kind of kitschy, understandable, and then it takes a very different direction, a very challenging direction with where that tree might have been planted, who that land might have belonged to before that tree was planted. And so when we talk about people being homeless, it's not just the person lying on Adelaide over a grate. It's people who've been forcibly removed under whatever circumstances for their land, whether it be a Muslim sect in the Far East, whether it be Rwandans in Central Africa, or whether it be Palestinians in what is today Israel. So I think when we talk about values of understanding the connection that people have with land, it can't be something that is narrowly defined as kinsman in the literal sense. When we talk about a kinsperson, however politically we want to define that term, we need to be thinking about anybody who's dispossessed of their land. The impact on those people as they slowly slide from dispossession of land to dispossessed of a livelihood and dispossessed of dignity. And the impact that has, not just on them, but on us, because we are those lechol yoshveha, the land, all of its inhabitants, both those who are personally may have been dispossessed of their land and dignity, and those who may be responsible if that has happened to others. So my challenge to you is when you read this week's Parashah, we talk about, I use the terms at the beginning, this universal utopian view of how we should view the world and being able to do a reset. Are we ready to do that reset? Are we ready to explore our responsibility for people falling into these various challenging, in gross understatement, situations in their lives? When we're willing to do that, then we can perhaps better consider exactly what proclaiming liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants might mean. So if anyone has any comments or questions, just unmute yourself first, Barb.
Michael?
I thought I had. Okay. Michael, if I may share with everybody, before we went on our trip to Israel, I read the book, The Lemon Tree, and that might be an interesting read for people.
A difficult read for people, but
very difficult.
That's why we're here.
Yeah.
I don't mean in this class. That's why we're here on this earth, to deal with those challenges and difficulties. Bela, go ahead. Sorry.
No, my question is, or my comment is when you fall short, I mean, given that we have all these either restrictions or commandments or directions, there's always an element that I know we talk about these as challenges, but how do you put yourself when you feel that you're not achieving those things? Like it's such a difficult spot in the sense that you read these things, you say you're going to challenge yourself. Up until what point is it acceptable? Because in my view, much of what we read in the Torah is very punitive. There's an element of if you don't do this, this is what's going to happen. If you should do this, you should do that. So there's this boxing in, but at the same time, there's this encouragement to do more and more. What happens when you fall short? Like, how do people ultimately resolve that kind of thing?
I think we all fall short. I don't think anybody, to be honest, I think there are very few people out there who reach their potential, perhaps professionally, artistically, socially, in sensitivity. I think there's always something we need to be striving for, and you need to find the right channel that allows you to use the resources and abilities and strengths that you have in order to deal with those things. You're right, the Torah is very harsh in some of the ways it deals with these issues. It's often sexually oriented, it's often politically oriented, it's nationally oriented. But those values have changed. And part of our understanding and developing the covenant that we have with God, if that's what we see our relationship here on earth, a covenant isn't tablets written or laws written in stone on those tablets. That's only a tiny portion of it. There's all the interpretation and commentary and development and understanding that ensues from generation to generation. And those values, although they're based in something very powerful, they change over time. We develop a different sensitivity to those laws, and we shouldn't be ashamed of that. That's, I think, the approach of many elements in Judaism, not all. There are many that are perhaps stuck in some historic expression of what Judaism means and not willing to uplift themselves beyond that. But you need to find ways that you can engage with these issues. You can't tackle it all at once. Rhoda wrote here, besides being dispossessed of economic or financial stability, many are suffering from mental illness, drug-related. How can we help them? You got to find a way that engages you and that you can use your skills with. I think education is an incredibly important way. And education, I'm not just saying education of the people who require education in order to do okay economically or financially. I'm talking about the people who don't know about these issues whatsoever. They need to be educated and made aware of the fact that these people exist. You'll talk, today it's much more difficult to deny that these situations exist because we're so exposed to social media in everything that's going on in the world, all social and political challenges that exist. So we're exposed to that stuff. But despite that, people, choose, if they're able to avoid dealing with that because it doesn't affect them directly. But as we talk about with other issues, vaccination among them, everything eventually affects us if we don't deal with those who are denied those benefits, those basic needs. I've mentioned this a couple of times. The idea that vaccinations need to be made available to everyone as quickly as possible and to the most vulnerable, because eventually, even for selfish reasons, if we don't deal with that, those variants or whatever are going to get here like they are today from India or from other places. If we don't help countries that have a challenge with that, it's similar with Israel. Israel has this huge Palestinian population, which is being vaccinated at a much slower rate. Palestinians work in Israel. They cross the border legally or illegally to work in different places in Israel. If we don't deal with their needs, we're not serving our own needs. And now you might say that's rather self-centered and selfish. We're thinking of ourselves. But often when you think of yourselves, out of necessity, you're helping others as well. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with seeing what you derive as a benefit from helping others. And you have to come to learn that those things go hand in hand. We're never going to do everything we can, Bela. But you got to start somewhere. You got to acknowledge that those challenges are our responsibility. You can't say that they're wrong. It's their fault. They're lazy. They're this. That's what we tend to make excuses for why people are in those dire straits. But if we allow that to happen, we're only making things more difficult for ourselves. Believe me, there are people who will do little, but they'll feel guilty about it. It's not like they can shut out the emotional implications of dealing with those situations. You speak with anybody who's driven by an intersection where a homeless person with a sign, whatever that person may look like, whatever gender they may be, walks up to the window and they either turn their head aside or just hope the light's going to change very quickly. You ask them 2 minutes later how they feel. I can assure you that encounter had some kind of minimal impact, whatever it was, on them. So even to help ourselves from having to deal with those situations, it's not a matter of, again, opening a window and carefully with a glove and a mask, handing that person a coin or something. It's a matter of doing things that prevent people from getting into that situation. That's where your kinsman has gotten to the point where they've lost a certain element of their dignity. And that's the most difficult thing to help somebody regain. You can help somebody regain a house, you can help somebody regain a job, but once their dignity has gone to the wayside, it's too late. It doesn't mean you can't do anything. But I shouldn't say it's too late. It means we've waited far too long to deal with that situation. So we have to find ways of nipping things in the bud, so to speak, and for righting certain wrongs that are generational or more in nature. Too much to sleep on, huh? Well, I appreciate you're all joining me this evening on, oh, it's late enough, you know what, we can do the Sfirat HaOmer. So let's see who remembers, while we're counting, count the things. I'm going to give you a challenge. We're going to count the days of the Omer. I want you to count how many things that you can do similar to the days of the Omer to deal with some of the issues we talked about and that people have thrown into the chat box this evening. So who remembers how many we counted yesterday?
I think it was 38.
So I'll give you a hint.
It was 39.
The Sundays are always the even weekdays. So the last Sunday was 35 days. So you're right. Yesterday we counted 39 days.
You're talking to the numerically challenged person here.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al sfirat haomer hayom 40 yom shehem 5 shavuot v'chamisha yamim laomer. So I wish you all good, meaningful counting and making those deeds that you choose to do count for the better of everyone else.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Everybody stay safe.